Let's talk about Annals of the Witch World by Andre Norton. This is 3 novels published in the 60s and republished in omnibus format in the 90s, so released 63, 64, 65. Andre Norton is a very important figure in classic sci-fi fantasy. She wrote other genre fiction too, romance, historical fiction, things like that. She lived 1912 to 2005, very long life and long career because she wrote till near the end of her life. She was a very early SFWA Grandmaster. She was one of the World Sci-Fi Society Gandalf Grandmasters. She was exceptionally important and influential in her peak. Lots of people considered her important. She's really forgotten now. Very important female author of the period too, for those who are interested in that. And probably she's most famous for now. It's hard to say given the relative lack of her fame, but she's probably most noted for the Witch World books. And the 3 books in this anthology are the earliest ones, pretty much. The first 2 cover Simon Tregarth and a witch who he comes into contact with in the Witch World. Her name is important, and you'll discover more about why that is if you read it. And then there are, I've got another set of 3, a trilogy called Chronicles of the Witch World in the omnibus, which is continuing Tregarth-related stories. The 3rd story, Year of the Unicorn, switches to a different region of the Witch World and covers a sort of witch and shape changes. So this was quite interesting because it's not sort of the 3 connected stories of one thing. It's basically a duology and then more or less a standalone in context, and then the other book is pretty much a trilogy I've got. They are, as you can kind of guess, they are novella length in modern terms. They are novel length in Hugo terms. They're 40,000 words plus. All of them are 150 to 190 pages, but in modern terms they are short novels really. There are a few subgenres feeding in. It's fantasy nominally, and it's kind of semi-heroic fantasy, but it's also really romantic fantasy. And by that I mean, and Norton was a romance writer, like Lindsay Buroker or most famously Mercedes Lackey. Someone like Lois McMaster Bujold, though for her it's much more spotty. The romance at the centre of the story is very central to its resolution. With Bujold, that's, as I say, to be clear, that's a lot more spotty, but it's a genre that influences her. But for Lackey, for Buroker, it's really the main thing behind the way their fantasy plots work out for all their and I mean there's some interesting strengths in that, and I think that's true of Norton too. That here the romances or romantic relationships are the fulcrum of not the whole plot, like there are events that happen, but they're the fulcrum of what matters in the plot and the stakes of the plot and things like that. Romantic fantasy, I think, also sometimes emphasizes, and you see this in Mercedes Lackey, but not always, emphasizes a certain kind of resolution-based resolution. That is to say that, you know, there's a bit more talking and a bit less fighting. There is action usually, but there's a degree to which maybe mutual understanding can be found and discovery is made. And there's a hint of that here, but there's also plenty of pre-traditional combat fantasy. There's also, it's world hopping. A big part of the conceit is that people enter the Witch World through portals and settle there. And that includes having magic versus science as a theme, in terms of civilizations or groups with science versus civilizations or groups with magic. Different kinds of magic too, not all identical kinds of magic. And in that area, I think this all feels quite fresh in terms of the 1960s, call it new wave sci-fi fantasy. I don't think this is new wave really, but see it in that context and you're thinking, yes, there's a freshness here in terms of the willingness to combine elements and to sort of get conceptual density by piling stuff up, which isn't always common in classic sci-fi fantasy, which often go quite high concept in some ways, I think. The first 2, their third-person point of view, you see through, you know, they are both limited points of view through character eyes. And they're chiefly about a human from our planet who's called Simon Tregarth, and he is in trouble, and he manages to contact a guy who gets people to disappear, and that guy sends him through a portal to another land, and in that place he ends up associated with a society where one society and the one that he gets associated with, is ruled by women with magical powers, and they're opposed by a few other cultures who they're allied with other cultures as well, which are interesting, and they're particularly facing off against another interloper culture, much like Simon is an interloper. The Colder are interlopers who have a weird kind of combination of magic and psychic power going on, like psionics and sorry, not magic, tech, psionic and tech power, yeah, that the kind of the conceit of those two books is significantly about dealing with that problem, and the cultures are really interesting. A way in which you can see this as, if you want to, if you choose to, as proto-feminist fiction, or in genre terms, proto-feminist SFF, is that there's an issue about how magic works, how relationships work, how the women who are the witches see themselves in relation to men, things like that. Some stuff that you can see perhaps influencing Robert Jordan, even if indirectly. What I mean is, it was in the environment, and so it influenced him. You can see a bit of that with the Aes Sedai, though very differently handled here. I think the Colder are great and weird and creepy and sinister. There is another point of view. Tregarth is one, the other is Lois, who is a young woman who is the heir to a duchy, and it's really interesting. She just snaps. Point of view Simon for a book of the book, and then Lois, and that's an interesting conceit, I think, and it works quite well. But she's a young woman who's an heir to a duchy associated with one of the Witch Nation's enemies, and she kind of gets caught up in various plots and stuff, and she becomes a semi-main character, and that gives variety. I think it's a way of keeping the world fresh through that limited third person. It's still mostly from, I think it's mostly from Simon's point of view. Big strengths of those two books. The cultures, the kind of setup of those cultures, I think is great. There are some interesting structural tricks, like the way the points of view are used to sort of give different perspectives on a world where world building is a soft world building, but a quite real one is a major emphasis. There are some really interesting magic ideas across different cultures, in both the first two and the third. The way that different magics work and different people operate with stuff like you also get, there's essentially some woodwosies. There's some Druidan functionally in one place who are only in there fairly briefly, in 2 points briefly over 2 books, and that you just think, that's the thing where she had an idea and she thought in a positive Tolkienian sense, not like it's a throwaway idea, but like this will just enrich and enliven the world. Quite different actually if you want to make that comparison to Stephen Donaldson, writing the 70s and the Thomas Covenant books, where he has enormous context and thoughts about the different kind of weird cultures in his world, but they all have major plot weight. And actually, there's sometimes strength in just being like, here's a different idea, here's a different culture, here's different magic, and it fits in here, and now we're moving on. I think that's not a bad thing necessarily. There are interesting ideas about the portals and the way she deals with different worlds in the books. I think that's done really well on the whole. The plots themselves are fun to see resolve. There's an asterisk on that, but the plots themselves are enjoyable to see resolve. The weaknesses, a big thing really is that I like the fact that they're pacey, but perhaps they're too pacey. I like the fact the writing is easy to read, and that's part of why they're pacey, but it's a very, very spare, very austere style, very functional. I can't think of many writers who come across to me as quite this austere. And I think what that leaves me with sometimes is, because it's very pulpy, it does not feel like Anne McCaffrey as a direct comparison for someone writing some similar things around the same time, so fusion sci-fi fantasy in her case. New wave, proto-feminist SFF. Lots of things you can compare Norton and McCaffrey on. McCaffrey's a little bit younger, like 13 years younger or something, 14 years younger. But you look at it and I don't, I am reading this and thinking, this feels stereotyped pulp in its form. And I like pulp writing, but in the same way, you can like modern writing and still think someone is trying too hard to be modern. Here there is perhaps just a bit too much of the stereotype of pulp and an uninspired pulpiness at points. I think, on the other hand, that's the first two books. The third book in this omnibus, Year of the Unicorn, which is the first High Hallock book rather than Estcarp. The Tregarth books are Estcarp in terms of region. This is High Hallock in the Dales, and Arvon for Year of the Unicorn. And I think Year of the Unicorn is a bit more interesting. It's about a woman who's called Gillen. She seems to be from a witch background, but due to shipwrecks and kidnaps and all kinds of confusing things, she's ended up kind of safely raised in an abbey. The nearest thing to it's never explicitly put this way, but a kind of almost Christian abbey in a world where other people are not Christians and don't believe in that stuff. There are hints of the way that Norton thinks about religion and spirituality throughout these books, which are interesting but never really explored, basically, because you're not sure. And it's interesting because she casts different views upon different ideas. She explores perspectives in a way that, say, in a modern context, we might think of Brandon Sanderson being quite good at. But it's all very brief, as I say. But yeah, Gillen is in an abbey, and it's far away from the land of the first two books, though there is one cultural connection as well as her. She ends up embroiled in... Basically, there's a marriage deal where the local lord has made an arrangement, a military alliance with some shape changers, the Wares, and they want brides as their price. And so once they've done their job, they get their bride price, and Gillen insinuates herself into that whole situation. And the shape changers are weird and sinister, and there's a lot of identity and confusion and even horror in both the shape changers and with Gillen. These are weird shape changing people who it's not clear if they're human or animal more than anything, and their point of view who doesn't really know who she is, and there's a lot of emphasis on magical illusion, and that interplays with our concepts of self and of the other. And this is continuous throughout the whole book. There's lots of trippy vision sequences, dream worlds, which are all exercising the same function and working into the same thing. They are, some of the strengths of the first two books, where you're finding out about different cultures and there's just weird places and things, are really emphasised in Year of the Unicorn. And the point of view is also first person rather than third person. You hear from Gillen throughout, and it really, I think, builds into the themes of identity and relationships. And it's a very good choice. It slightly frees up. She has a very arch writing style, and it slightly frees her up from that, because she doesn't have to add millions of extra descriptive passages, but there is an investment in Gillen's identity and in what the shape changes are, which is perhaps at points lacking in the first two books, where from Lloyd's and Simon's point of view, we care about them, we care about what's going on, but there's still a bit of a cool distance from the stakes facing them. And I think this is stronger for that. These are interesting books. None of them are bad. They're all fun. I enjoyed all of them to different degrees. I have others of hers, as I say, which I might well read off the back of this. I haven't been turned off Andre Norton forever. But there is a degree to which you can feel they haven't survived the test of time as well as some. Though she may be somewhat out of favour, I don't think people don't see Anne McCaffrey. I don't think people see Anne McCaffrey as irrelevant and dated in the same way as they might reading Norton. And maybe that's about longevity, maybe that's about scope of influence, like direct influence. But I think there are things in McCaffrey which you can see just last better than Witchworld. It's interesting, though. I'd say Marion Zimmer Bradley is another obvious rough contemporary in terms of those early major female sci-fi fantasy writers. Lee Brackett is actually contemporary, but her big hits are slightly earlier than this, and Brackett is much better. In that subject, both in the genre in general in the 60s, she's important but dated, and in terms of some of the other trailblazing figures you might compare her to, I'm not sure she lasts as well. However, if you find those ideas, the themes, the subgenre mash, particularly in that third book, Year of the Unicorn, which I think is a genuinely quite good book, I would recommend these. And I'd say, especially if you're reading 150 pages, you can just get that done. You don't need to panic. If you're bored after 80 pages, just read a bit more and you'll be done. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. If you have read these, tell me what you think. And yeah, what other romantic fantasies would you recommend? Till next time.